tightly coupled system. The entire ecosystem itself has opened up, and it is an amalgam, it's a medley of multiple stakeholders who are connected to each other doing their bit. And obviously, when there are so many ecosystem players, obviously there would be a need for regulation. And even though it is said, and this is the common saying that business is ahead of regulation by about 2 decades. But apart from regulation, what is important in the fintech ecosystem is security. And security is a combination of technology, is a combination of processes, is a combination of discipline, and it is also a combination of self-governance or self-regulation. And like that the dark side is ahead of them. For fintechs now to keep up with the kind of cybersecurity issues that crop up, the cyber threats that emerge, because the cyber threats themselves are becoming more and more sophisticated. And therefore, the solutions that have to be found will have to be through technology to some extent, through processes and governance, at the second level. And the third would be also in terms of mitigation. Assuming that a cyber breach has occurred, how does one minimize the impact that that breach has had on that business entity or in that ecosystem? So I think it is a combination of these three that will actually ensure that the dynamism that is there in the market, the dynamism that is there which brings out new products, new UIs, new user experiences, new customer use cases, are not deprived or not stunted because of challenges that are also cropping up, perhaps at a faster rate. This is what I think this panel would consider, because there is also something on risk mitigation. There are also things on technology that one can use for risk mitigation. Having said this, I must say the developments that have happened in India over the last 10 to 12 years have been really heartwarming. And the security measures that have been implemented, either via regulations that have come, or through self-regulation, or because entities in the marketplace that have security as their business, providing solutions to the market players, have helped India be in a much more solid environment on the security front compared to many of the countries outside. I will now leave it to the others to carry on.
Thanks a lot. I think I'm just going to sort of connect the dots here and come to you, Sanket. Rajesh, you mentioned that that you have to convince your businesses sort of to go slow a bit, balance out. Then you have the board. Now the board is supposed to be responsible even under the Companies Act and even under some of the RBI regulations. A lot of responsibility vests at the board. And then you mentioned about at the grassroots level, right? So there is that whole connection or a chain of all the stakeholders, including the third-party vendors, where you need to create a lot of awareness, because unless there is awareness and understanding of the risk involved and therefore the steps required to be taken, nothing will work, right? So, we discussed that you have some quantification of the risk that, one can understand. So, I'm just leading from first question to the other to say that how do you quantify the risk and how do you convince the board and other stakeholders to be part of, this entire exercise that is required to create a resilience network?
Sure. First of all, lovely to see a houseful audience, right, in this hour. Again, repeating the same things what the other co-panelists said. But having said that, I'd just like to put some light on the topic which Gauri just mentioned. Cybersecurity is no more just a function of technology. It's a function of business. And the decisions that are made in organizations are just not based on technology, which is also a point on the first question, which was balancing between innovation and security. Now, how to take this informed decisions, right? Because it's just not the CISO or the CIO or the head of security who's just involved in that decision. The finance department is also involved. The operations is also involved. The top management is also involved. In case of like mid-sized startups or growing startups, then the board is also involved. Each of them look into cybersecurity from a different perspective. It is very important that all of them see it from their organizational context. Now, what do I mean by that? Every organization is different. Every organization is unique. Even if we were in the same payment gateway industry, two organizations are different, how they operate, what are the business goals, and to that extent. What is that one thing that every management understands? Anyone? One thing that every top management of every organization understands. Money. You go and tell them, we have 50,000 vulnerabilities. The response would be, okay, now what? You go and tell them, we have cyber risk of $50,000. To mitigate that, we need to invest $10,000. The sign-off for the budget approval would happen on a much faster rate. Now, how it's exactly done or how we do it, I'll just give a brief context on that. There are different models that are there in the industry which US follows and all, but that does not apply to every market. There's something called Monte Carlo simulation and the FAIR model, which is very unfair, by the way. Right, because it takes 42 assumptions for doing your risk quantification. So what we did was we took a cost function, which is known as the Gordon-Loeb model, and we put 5 parameters into it. It took us 2.5 years of research to do it. We take 5 parameters. One, which sector the organization belongs to. Second, what are the number of employees that are there, because that consists of the insider threats. Third, what are the different technologies that you are using? So take, for example, when Log4j was at spike, the Java applications were at a higher risk of getting exploited. Fourth, the different locations from which you are operating. Why is that important? Supposingly, a particular organization had their office in Ukraine while the Russia-Ukraine war was going on. So the probability of getting that breach is much higher than any other place in the world at that point of time. The last but not the least, the market capitalization by that particular organization, because that essentially adds on to the financial impact that it gets into. With that, the impact of the mid-cap and the large-cap indexes are also taken into account so that we have an idea of the economical state of that particular nation. So it's a different thing that you get with respect to each nation, each region, each organization. When you have that kind of insight, you can make those decisions in your organization. Should I invest in this particular thing, or should I expect in that particular thing? Right? If a particular policy implementation on your existing HIDS, which is host intrusion detection system, is giving you 30% more efficiency, you do not need an XDR. If it's not, then you need to implement an XDR. Just to sum it around, I was just having conversation with few of the organizations, and people generally have a very general notion, it's that cybersecurity is costly because you are not getting into the data. Right? Implementation of cybersecurity is costly. If you do it in a strategic way, it's not. There are very basic things, just covering the first answer to the first question as well, which you can do as organizations. There are simple plugins when you are coding itself, which checks for your OSP top 10. It's a basic hygiene checks. You can subscribe to the certain guidelines that are there who send you regular updates on the threat intels that are there, which you can keep on updating. These are basic, it does not cost you anything. It's absolutely free of cost. So that kind of risk quantification and with respect to each risk scenarios is something that is very important. And one more thing, people often I see put a lot of stress on, we follow all the regulations that are there. Just to give an trivia fact, SEBI was formed after Bombay Stock Exchange, a lot of decades later. Regulations only come when there is an incident. It does not come before. Right? So making those informed decisions with those quantified risks is very important to have a smooth trajectory.
Thanks a lot. I think you put it across quite well, how to sort of map the risk and what are the parameters. So, Ambuj and Sandeep, over to you on your thoughts on basically, how to get a buy-in from all the stakeholders, and also please focus also on the, educating the masses.
Right. Thank you, Gauri. So yeah, as Sanket rightly put out, that cyber quantification is something really important. But most important thing is how you articulate your key risk indicators. Now, as a CISO function, my key responsibility should be that I jot down my key risk indicator in a fashion that everybody in the board understands that every stakeholders within the organization has to understand it. So what principle as a CISO function that we follow is that we look into a lot of technology inputs from our sides. There are EDR agents, there are multiple perimeter security, threat intelligence, a lot of things come to us. So the analogy I can draw over here is from the perspective that you consider yourself as a pilot. So when a plane is flying, a pilot looks into so many things. He looks into the height, altitude, air pressure, wind direction. But to the customer, he need to tell that when we are going to reach the destination, right? How much time it is going to take. And if there is a turbulence, that has to be told in advance. So those are the parameters that you have to keep in mind when you articulate this key risk indicators for the organization. And that helps you in articulating it very appropriately and get the buy-in from the people, because you are not bombarding them with the information like XDR, vulnerabilities, this and that. What you need to tell them is something actionable. So that is what we, from the CISO function perspective, should follow as an organization to get the buy-in from all the stakeholders from the board and everywhere.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is to each stakeholder explain in their own terms, basically, right? I mean, what they will understand. Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, a very good afternoon to all of you. I think a couple of things that I believe is very much needed, when cybersecurity requires to connect at an organization level. I think we have all been discussing that senior management and board need to have a buy-in in cyber matters, but the perspective out here is that how effective is that engagement? And to bring that engagement, I think a couple of things that are needed, right? One is that how effectively you engage and educate your board members and the senior members on the cyber matters, right? It may not be very apt if you look at doing all technical discussions, because they will hardly understand. You need to have a very constructive dialogue, making them understand in a business language and get their buy-in into what your cyber strategies are. Second important factor that I believe is that it's all about fostering cybersecurity as a culture within the organization, right? Cybersecurity is not a CISO's or a CISO function's job. It has to connect at all layers in the organization. And every individual and a person has a specific role to play in the cyber matters. I think as a cyber function, very important for you is to basically define your strategy, discuss the strategy with the senior management, and get their buy-in into your security strategies. The aspects that will be needed is how effective is the implementation of the cyber investments that you went, and demonstrate them to your senior management. I think a paradigm shift from looking at return on investments is making risk-based security investments will obviously help you in getting the buy-in from the senior management. And lastly, I believe that I think resiliency and availability of a business is not a single man's responsibility or single function's responsibility, and all departments have a role to play. And such prerogatives are to set forth in the organizations such that you are, in today times, you are like always, there was a mention of 24/7. So you have, as a business, have to define how will you want to be resilient in times of a cyber event.
I think that's very important, because what we have noticed is especially for the startups, some of you may be in that phase where you are raising capital, you have investor, sort of board, sort of managing or, taking decisions. So what we are also doing is, as a part of our firm, that we are trying to educate the board, investor board, because unless the investor board realizes the importance, they may not actually agree for those type of investments. Even, it may appear disproportionate at the inception, but those are required for a long-term sustainability, right? So I think that education, and the other one I think want to once more sort of emphasize that even under the Companies Act, the board may actually suffer individual liability if they don't pay attention to this. So this aspect, even on the legal side, needs to be understood by the board members, right? I think all of you mentioned about strategies and all of that. So, what are the best practices that we are noticing? And some of the people will be, technical people here. So even if you want to talk about some technologies that are evolving. So Rajesh, I'm coming to you now back again to sort of understand, are there any, sort of core things that the audience should take away from a strategy implementation, whether on the technology side, best practices we mentioned about data minimization, use of blockchain, if you can just sort of throw some light on that.
Yeah, thanks, Gauri. See, from strategy perspective, one thing I just want everybody to notice, there's no one size fit all. I mean, it's not a copy paste. You can copy paste tools, you can copy paste configurations, but you can't copy paste strategy. So you have to do first your own risk assessment with a mindset that what exposure do I carry? What is my risk appetite? I mean, first define your risk appetite. Basis that, agree on first what are the risks that you are living with, what is it that you can live with, and what needs to be mitigated. Your strategy should only be driven after you have done your risk assessment. That should be granular. That should be oriented to the compliances that apply to you. That should also take care of what is the organizational risk appetite. If your organization, suppose it's a regulated entity, or you have a client-facing role where you cannot even have maybe from RPO, RTO perspective, or maybe a breach perspective, you can't afford a single incident. Your strategy will be totally different than an entity which is rating itself on a different parlance, not a compliance-driven organization. So one, agree on what is it that you want to set right, get that buy-in from your leadership, then drive that down. Now, what are the strategic things which typically can fit into that? While I'll not talk on the strategy, I leave that to each one's wisdom here. But some of the key things which I see over last few years, how it is transforming because of the digital transformations, because of the compliance, because of the regulations, because of the attack surface, because of incidents that are happening elsewhere. Three key areas which I feel are the focus ones. One is the data minimization, which is important considering also with the PDP which recently has been signed off. Now, what does that minimization mean? I'm giving a contrast to what I started with, the data maximization, which typically we believe is always good for capturing a lot of information. In a minimization, figure out what you actually need for that, right? Cut down whether it is an online form or an offline form. Don't wait that digitization or a PDP is insisting only on an online or a digitized form. I'll do it offline. Even if it is your hard copy, even if it is your online form, even if it's a web form, whichever form is, what information do you actually need? First, minimize that. When you minimize it, have the intent also documented. Purpose limitation is an important area there. Are you clearly telling the customer what are you taking this data for? What are you going to do with this data? And then you drive its path forward. The next element in data minimization would be, once you have captured this data, do you understand how this data is going to flow within your organization? Have you created a structural data flow analysis which gives you an inventory, which tells you what data is leaving your organization, whether the basic protection controls are there in place, whether the retention guidelines are there in place, because you should not be retaining beyond the purpose of it. That's again an element of minimization. So a minimization can work out from various angles, but these are some of the key elements which I think one should think in, and it becomes very important for us. Would make, I mean, considering the PDP implementation, and today I was just reading a article which was saying the Minister of the Minister of State for this, Mr. Rajiv, had already said that 6 months will be the time given for organizations to implement it. 6 months is too short for a larger organization where the data inventorization would be a significant exercise in itself, right? But if that comes in, first thing is to work out a play on minimization. The second element which I want to touch upon, which should definitely be in your strategy. Leave aside, again, I'm not touching your threat intels, red teaming and all that stuff, which I believe is basic hygiene that all of you would be necessarily putting in place. The second leg, especially from a fintech and a financial perspective, which is important to be targeted as is authentication layer. The large number of breaches are happening on identity thefts. There are a lot of weaknesses that are typically seen on the identity layer. Now, what is it that is happening? And there are a lot of research, a lot of product sets, a lot of things which are happening on strengthening the authentication, whether it is the typical traditional password-based authentication. Can I go for a password-less authentication? Can I go for a biometric authentication? Or I go for a behavioral-based authentication? Now, all these things would be or should be important for you, considering what is coming to you. How do you claim the guy on the other side is the person? And it is going beyond it. It is no longer the guy on the other side. It is a system on the other side, or it's an application on the other side. Go for API security when you think through your components on the other side totally differs. Now, how is the keys being exchanged? Again, a part of authentication. So that authentication leg is an important element according to me, which should fit into your strategy, wherein you have to maybe challenge what is currently being worked upon and with what is coming up further. And the last element, which in the interest of time I'll just slip over to, is the blockchain and the cloud and all that stuff. And before I come to the emerging technologies, but blockchain is one good area to explore. But again, whether it is a private blockchain or are you going with a trusted parties blockchain? Blockchain inherently has good benefits. You can ensure immutability, you can trace the transaction, the fraudulent come down, identity-based platforms are riding a lot on blockchain. But that itself has vulnerability. So you have to balance it out. It's not that I buy blockchain or I put a blockchain platform in my environment, everything goes safe. That's not the case. You have to invest in the security controls of that. And if I come to the emerging technology, the last part of Gauri's question, what I see is what are the areas that typically the organizations are investing in, would be investing in. One definitely is the threat intel. You need visibility. You need to know what is not happening right. You may be protecting what you know, but what you don't know is an unknown. I mean, that may haunt you someday. Be sure that you are ready for that. Red team is an important area. Cloud is another area. AI-based tools, because you cannot have people deployed in your SOC or your threat intel anomaly-based detection tools and all. It has to be AI-driven, which picks up anomalies, which baselines and gives you that intelligence back. So a lot of research, a lot of things are being worked upon, but on the threat vector side, we importantly should invest into these to strengthen the environments. These emerging technologies would matter to the organizations at large. And that's all. I think I'll come back to you.
I think thanks for that. Before I go to Shankar and Sanket on the additional points, Dr. Behl, we have been discussing about even the third party, that the fintechs sort of, or even for that matter, banks maybe, partnering with. How do you, whatever has been said, by panel members, how do you ensure that third parties are equally part of?
Okay, thank you. So we do have some demos bringing it to life, the journeys that are already live, like I think Deepa mentioned about many countries India can go. Please have a look at our stall. We do have it here in case we have time, we can play, but we can do it later. Okay.